and welcome to the Seatrade Maritime podcast. I'm Emma Howell, the Content Director at Seatrade Maritime News. Today's episode was recorded at CMA Shipping in Connecticut, Stamford in March 26. Today I have the pleasure of talking to Ben Bailey, Director of Programme at Mission to Seafarers. So welcome, Ben.
Hello, thank you for having me, and thank you for the support of Seatrade to all of the events, particularly to the Mission to Seafarers at your conferences. Thank you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and you make it much easier by being a joy to interview as well. Ben, before we start talking about the index, I'd like to just touch on what's happening in the world at the moment, and obviously the support that Mission to Seafarers is trying to give, particularly to those that are involved in the Arabian Gulf at the moment. Can you just talk us through the situation?
Yes, so obviously it's still a very volatile situation with a huge series of unknown quantities. We have colleagues that are working in the UAE, who are working in Bahrain, in Jordan. We also have some contacts with other organizations that operate in Iran. And across the Middle East, we provide a whole range of general welfare and well-being services for seafarers. But we also deal with a huge number of abandonments. And so we are continuing to ship visit where we can possibly do that in a safe way. But there is understandably a lot of tension, a lot of fear. Seafarers are coming to the ends of their contracts. They want to know how they're going to get home. They want to get out. They feel very much isolated, but they also know that the industry is doing its best to try and support them. So we have a range of mental health and well-being resources that we've made available to seafarers and their families. We're going to be launching another series of our trauma literature, managing traumatic responses in distressing circumstances, which will be coming out early next week. But, we continue to provide as much as we can, as well as through the Happy at Sea app, to be there for seafarers in this time. And we'll stay there for as long as they need us.
I mean, an added challenge at the moment, of course, is over much of the Gulf airspace is shut. So even trying to get seafarers home is an almost impossible scenario. Absolutely,
and indeed for those people that live and work there who want to maybe go home or get out for a period of time. So there remains so many unknowns, and I think where this is different from COVID is that COVID was a situation where nobody really knew what was going to happen next. I'm hoping that there will be some, strategists who will be able to see where, the next stage might happen in this conflict, and then where the corridors might open up. But I think above all, what we need is a coordinated response, both from industry, and that includes the welfare sector. And we're certainly working with our partners at ICMA, at NAMA, with the ISWAN, International Seafarers Welfare Association, to try and see what we can do together to support those seafarers and their families.
And you and I have sat on a couple of panel sessions over the last couple of days, and one of the areas that keeps coming out is communication to seafarers, communication to the broader industry as well about what is happening to seafarers. What can we do better as an industry?
I think what's been interesting over the last couple of days of listening to the debate here at CMA has been that issue of, it often comes back to that sort of broader issue of sea blindness, that perhaps the industry doesn't quite have the standing with either governments or with other institutions as perhaps other sectors in the transport and logistics industry. And so that coordinated response, both to governments, to remind them of the importance of the region, to remind them of the importance of the cargoes that come in and out of that region, of actually the people who are on board those ships. It's been very interesting. We've heard quite rightly in the media about the numbers of ships that have sadly been attacked.
Yep.
But if you don't work in the industry, you don't automatically associate that with 15 people working on board that ship, or 24 or 30 people working on board that particular vessel. And I think we've got to get better at telling the human side of shipping. Once we've got that, we can then actually move forward. So it's about putting the human touch, the humanity, back into the maritime industry, because once we can get people to connect with the seafarers, then I think the response will be quicker and easier for them.
Yeah, because of course we heard from Hamish Norton this morning, who was talking about the Star Bulk dry bulk tanker that had been sadly targeted overnight, and he was talking about the seafarer anguish. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but it was the mental anguish that comes with that, and I don't think most lay people would understand what that feels like, and how not being able to escape from that particular moment must feel as well.
Absolutely, and I think it's that's why the communication is so important.
Yeah.
Because you've got that loss of agency because those seafarers are working hard still on those vessels, but they don't have defensive measures. It's not like they're not warships, so they can't shoot down drones, etc. And they really are to some extent sitting ducks, and they're caught in the middle of something that is not of their making, not of their choosing, and they have no side and no affiliation. They're just going about their day-to-day business to keep the world fueled and fed. And that's the story we have to keep telling. That's the humanitarian side that we have to keep sharing. And I think it's also important that where companies have either the resources to put in place mental health and well-being resources for their crews, that they do so. They open up helplines if that's necessary, but also they use the entire maritime welfare sector. So many of us are trained in critical incident stress counselling, we're trained in suicide awareness, we're trained in traumatic responses, and there is a global network of port chaplaincies that span well over 800 ports, not just from the mission, but from other societies as well. And so we are part of that response. And so if people can use us, then, please do so.
And just to add to that, because I know this because we've discussed it previously, it's not just the seafarers, it's the seafarers' families that you support as well.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
Let's talk now about the Seafarers Happiness Index. I'm sure everybody in the audience is familiar with this, but just in case, can you just recap what that is?
Yeah, so the Seafarers Happiness Index is what we call the sort of barometer of social change and the voice of the seafarer. I think for such a long time, the industry has been caught up with that buzzword of benchmarking. It loves to be able to compare itself to other sectors, other companies, other indices. And yet there was never really a sort of targeted and intentional benchmarking procedure for asking seafarers, what do you think about certain issues?
Right.
We put the pressure on seafarers to enact the safe movement of vessels. We put pressure on the seafarers to enact various IMO protocols, various other procedures, etc. And yet very rarely do we ask them on a global front, what does that mean for you? So 10 years ago, working with Stephen Jones, the founder of the Seafarers Happiness Index, we created a very simple survey where we do just that. We ask them 10 questions around a range of issues, and we see what they feel about certain things, and we benchmark that against what's going on in the global picture, so that we try to give industry not the answers, but we want to give them a space where we can try and discuss these issues in an appropriate way.
So how many seafarers take part in the survey?
It varies from quarter to quarter, but as a general rule, we have somewhere in the region of between 10 and 15,000 seafarers who will complete the survey every year. And we also run a number of private bespoke happiness indexes, or indices, I guess you should call them, for companies that want to do their own internal benchmarking.
Right.
It's a relatively decent sample of those seafarers. We have some crews that choose to do it every quarter. We have some seafarers who choose to do it maybe just once a year. And so that's why we have always said that the index is not a scientific survey. It's not carried out in a sort of rigorous scientific environment. The intention has always been to provide a space where seafarers can talk and to pick up on those key themes that they're telling us. That's why, to some extent, the numbers that we publish, they have meaning, they're valuable, but actually it's the stories, it's the narrative that we hear from so many seafarers as part of their answers, which really goes to build up that really important picture.
Where do they do the survey? Through the app?
Yeah, so that they can carry it through our Happy at Sea app, which they can download on Google or on iStore or wherever they get their apps from. They can also do it via a simple website. They can do it in our seafarers centres. And very often when our teams are going on board, so in an average year, the Mission to Seafarers will visit around about 40 to 50,000 ships a year across the globe. And so very often we will take on the survey at that point, and whilst the teams are on board, providing services to the seafarers, then there'll be an opportunity for them to complete it there as well.
So you mentioned this has been taking place over a decade now. What's been your kind of key learnings over the last 10 years, and how has it changed over that period as well?
I think what's been really interesting is that it's taken really a decade to get seafarers to actually to give us more information.
Yeah.
On one hand, I think seafarers are somehow sort of almost the most surveyed population of any workforce in any sector, because I think there's always a report in Tradewinds or Lloyd's List about, seafarers are saying this, or, some university is going out to do something around seafarer abandonment or whatever the issue might be. And yet we're constantly talking to them, but we're always talking to them seemingly in that very sort of rigorous fashion, whereas this has just kind of been that free space where they can talk. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is seafarers have actually started to own that space. We have to kind of clean up some of the language that they use because, they certainly have quite an extensive vocabulary for people that work at sea. A blue vocabulary when they're talking about what's going on. But I think the overarching issue that constantly comes across from us, I think, is that they feel deeply respected and they're very deeply proud to be seafarers. They feel respected by their peers. They feel respected by their families, by their communities. But they somehow feel that the relationship between shoreside and the seaside, there's still some work that needs to be done there. They don't feel necessarily as part of the equation as perhaps they would like to be.
So is that a case of recognition, and if so, who by? By the ship owning?
Yeah, I think it's partly that. I think also there's an issue around, how their views are represented, maybe at international fora, in international debate. It's very difficult just by the nature of the job that those seafarers are doing, that you can't have them at conferences every year, you can't have them at round tables, you can't have them always at the IMO, etc. And of course they have institutions that they can work through. But there does seem to be this element that if only they were given the opportunity to feed in more, that actually they would relish that chance to do it. Because ultimately they're the ones that are enacting, IMO protocols, procedures, whatever it might be on a day-to-day basis. And yet we don't always necessarily go back and check that it's working for them. We go and check to make sure that it's working within whatever the framework is that we're working with.
And what does recognition look like as well? Could it look like financial recognition? Could it look like an award? Who here doesn't think they deserve a pay rise? We'd all like more money if there was the opportunity for it. And so I'm not sure it's necessarily about the reward in terms of financial, but it is actually about being part of that wider discussion. Yeah. Okay.
And that very much comes through in the index time and time again every quarter that we run it.
We touched on it just briefly, but mental health has become much more visible in maritime over the last decade. What trends have you seen in the index around well-being and psychological health at sea?
I think what's really interesting is that I've been working in the maritime welfare space nearly for 19 years. And even back in those days, we weren't really talking about mental health as much as we are today.
Yeah.
And if we were talking about mental health, there wasn't really the kind of vocabulary with which to do it in an appropriate way. And I think industry was still pretty macho. There was still this kind of feeling that, if seafarers were open and willing and wanting to talk about their feelings, that somehow they might be shied upon, they might be, taken the mickey out of. And actually in the index over the last 10 years, we have found a lot of seafarers use it as a cathartic space to really talk about how they're feeling. They talk about the unintended consequences of Wi-Fi, about the fact that they love being able to be in touch with their families, but actually, other issues have started to arise, such as, an increased use in addictive behaviors, particularly around pornography or indeed around gambling. And we have seafarers talking about that. We have seafarers, though, that when it comes to mental health, they are talking about the fact that they may have been in the industry for decades and now their companies have got mental health and well-being programs in place. They've got these telephone helplines and they no longer feel or are made to feel ashamed about talking about it. And I think that's really interesting, given the countries and the nationalities that seafarers come from, where some of those nationalities are still on their own journey around mental health and well-being. In the West, it's very common to stand up and talk about how you feel. Not quite so in Eastern Europe, maybe a bit more in the Philippines, maybe not so much in Indonesia, for example. So every seafarer nationality is starting from a different point, and yet they all seemingly feel now that they have a vocabulary and a mechanism that they are able to talk about their mental health and their well-being.
That's actually really interesting because, and in fact she's in the audience, I was talking to Liz Schmidt from Women Offshore yesterday, and a lot of our discussion was around the mental health support to women who've suffered sexual assault at sea, etc. So it's interesting that obviously people feel safer being able to talk about these instances within the survey. So where I'm leading to, is there a balance between male and female seafarers, how they fill in the form? Do you find it is a balance based on, I suppose it's never going to be equal because there isn't an equal amount to start with, but are you seeing that balance there?
I mean, I think we always say that we would like more female seafarers to take part in the survey. They certainly are underrepresented in the happiness index, and we would certainly like that to change, and we're working on it. I think when it comes to seafarers talking about difficult subjects like sexual assault and sexual harassment, they're much more likely now to talk about, what remedies have been put in place in the index. And they're also much more likely to talk about the fact that they're not as afraid, certainly from what we're seeing, they're not as afraid to talk to their companies because they know that there are wider protocols, wider instruments in place there which they can use and which they can utilise.
Keeping on the kind of decade of results, obviously we've had COVID, the pandemic during that period, we've had economic changes, we've now got geopolitical changes. What are you seeing from the data?
I think to some extent the happiness index kind of came into its own during the COVID pandemic. And so that almost has, these kind of geopolitical issues have really kind of provided that sort of real sort of litmus test about what seafarers are feeling at that particular moment. You're always going to get some crews who are, overjoyed about the fact that they've got better Wi-Fi on board as a result of that, or they've got a new helpline, or they'll be able to be in touch with their families. And then you've got the other end of that situation. But I think what we've also seen, which I think really threw us when we looked at it, is that whenever there are things such as COVID and you've got that crisis, or indeed what's going on right now, and you've got the rerouting going on, and therefore you've got longer journeys, actually seafarers say that's better for us. We'd rather have a longer journey because it means that, yes, it's longer time away from our families, but actually we can build a better system on board. We have a better chance of having community on board, of spending time with each other and not just being locking ourselves away in our cabins. And so I think, a bit like the Wi-Fi issue, there are unintended, to some extent, in this instance, positive outcomes from some of these geopolitical events, because it has enabled seafarers to have better quality time as a crew, and that can ultimately only be sort of a good thing for the safety of that vessel.
So that kind of leads on to technology, because I'm working on the basis 10 years ago there wasn't a group app for seafarers to communicate within. So that's a good example of technology being used for good, and we've talked to a couple of instances where it hasn't been so great. Where other areas are you seeing technology for good? Is it learning? Is it communication?
It's primarily around communication with their families. The downside and I have to say they talk much more about the downside of communication rather than the upside.
Really?
And that's largely around what they perceive to be a disconnect with the shore side. So you now have masters that are being dragged into Teams calls every 5 minutes.
Right.
There's constantly that pressure from the office to be part of decisions that are happening ashore. And on the one hand, sort of, you could sit there and say, well, actually, if you want to be part of the discussion, this is how it's going to have to be. But at the other side, the seafarers tell us that they don't feel that the shoreside necessarily properly understand what life is like on board the vessel. I remember one seafarer master wrote, you either trust me with this $1 million vessel or you don't. Because he just felt all of a sudden, after decades of being in charge of his own ship, that suddenly he'd got this kind of, eye watching over him and watching over his every single move. So I think, there's no doubt communication is a positive thing, but actually it's around having that balance and managing those expectations on both sides.
A recurrent theme that comes up time and time again is port experiences and shore leave. Why is this still such a problem? And I know you and I have talked about, again, if you look at geographies, it does tend to be where people are as well. And you mentioned the Middle East is particularly challenging. Talk to us a bit more about that.
I mean, any one of my colleagues from any one of the other maritime ministry associations would say the same. We have all seen a dramatic decline in the number of seafarers coming ashore. And one of the things that I have been quite interested in probably the last sort of 6 to 8 months is that seemingly it's not because of a decision that's been taken by a shipping company necessarily. Very often we're seeing now that the ports themselves don't have either the facilities, the infrastructure, the immigration, or they just don't have the ability, or they don't want to have the ability to facilitate shore leave. And so it continues to be a really difficult thing for seafarers. They talk about it on a regular basis. They complain about it. And I think, there is a lot of work that needs to be done with port operators, not so much with ship owners. I think that argument is kind of dealt with. It's with the port operators to ensure that they are properly facilitating the safe shore leave for seafarers. There's a port in the UK, just as an example, where the seafarers come ashore. It's a container port. The port in question has said you must use one of the port minibuses to drive you from the berth to the main gate. That is a 1 mile journey, not even a mile. Those seafarers are charged over $150 per person to be driven in that bus. We are not allowed to go in and get them. Other welfare agencies aren't allowed to go in and get them. And it's those kinds of hurdles, scandalous hurdles, I might say, which we've got to try and identify and root out, because we're not going to solve the shore leave issue unless we can get all of our sort of ducks in a row in that respect.
I mean, when you have that information, who are you telling that to try and influence that change?
So in the case of a UK situation, we would work through what we call a Port Welfare Committee, which is normally, members of the ports, the immigration, unions and other sort of interested parties in that location. And we try and impress upon them the difficulty and the unfairness of it, and we try and bring about a solution. But there are very little kind of formal recourses that we can go through. I suspect we could probably make a complaint under the Maritime Labour Convention in certain instances, but it's not easy. It's not easy.
And you've got to hear about it to start with. So, yeah. Again, going back to the data, what are the most persistent operational challenges affecting seafarer well-being today?
I think all of it can be summed up with the two themes of fatigue and safe manning. There is no doubt that, and probably people listening will hear that sort of topsy-turvy way of that I'm describing the index, in that, there is that huge deep appreciation for and pride in what they do. Yet, on the other hand, they don't feel that they're properly being respected. You've got the communication issue, but then you've got more work as a result of that communication issue, which is having an impact on their fatigue, on their working hours. We have large numbers of seafarers who report that they are being ordered to keep separate books in terms of their working hours, etc. And Tradewinds did a piece on that not too long ago, and that is obviously a much wider issue within the industry. But there are seafarers who seemingly are still having to deal with that, and the fact, and very often, a simple line that comes through time and time again is we don't have enough people on board. And it feels as though minimum safe manning has now become the acceptable level of manning rather than the minimum that it should be. And so because there is this increased workload, seafarers are feeling increasingly more tired, and all of that gets wrapped up into well-being, welfare, and ultimately the safety of the vessel. So I would put it probably under those two key issues.
Is the lack of or not having enough crew on board to do with the fact that we have a big recruitment issue in the industry, or is it as simple as they don't want to pay for as many people as required? Or couldn't you possibly say?
No comment. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I mean, as I say, I've been around here for a long time, and there seemingly has always been kind of a manning crisis.
Yeah.
And yet, I find so it's quite extraordinary that in 20 years that seemingly has never been fixed. I'd also make the point that in places like the Philippines, particularly in the Philippines, there are at least 20,000 seafarers who graduate from maritime colleges every year who are not going to find work. And yet, if there is so many vacancies, why aren't we utilising these people who are available for work? Now, that's a fairly simplistic argument, I guess, to some extent, but it does seem to me that industry will always push. Industry will always ultimately push for a commercial decision, and unfortunately, seafarers are a commercial. Are treated as a line in the accounts rather than the people that they are.
As we move into the next decade, we have decarbonisation, we have autonomous shipping, we have many, many different areas of focus. How do you think that is going to shape the index as we move forward?
I think it will depend on how industry responds to the data that we're publishing every quarter. And I think what's really interesting in those private bespoke surveys is that where those companies then engage with what the seafarers are saying, and they actually go back and they feed back to them. And we have one particular company that every 6 months will have an all-crew meeting online, brings them all together via Starlink, and we'll just talk to them about what they've been talking about. And if they can put pressure on technical managers, or they can put pressure on other areas that are managing their ships, then they will do that for the benefit of those seafarers. So where we're seeing, shoreside and leadership respond and act, even if it's just to say we hear you but we can't do anything about it, seafarers are responding much more positively. I think going forward, we'll be launching in April the shore-based happiness index. Anyone for a gimmick? And so we'll be wanting to hear from shoreside as to what they think about some of the issues of working with seafarers and working with ships, because I think it's all very well to hear the crew, but now we need to hear what the shoreside teams are saying to see if the problems are still the same, and where perhaps the gaps might be, and what we might be able to just present as a space for seafarers to talk, and for the whole industry to talk and find solutions. So that will be starting hopefully in April, and we're very excited about that.
Excellent. Ben, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for all the work that you and obviously other charities do to support seafarers. Well, thanks again, Ben, and thank you everyone in the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today on the Seatrade Maritime News Podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode.